My guest today is Dr. Christian Bokhove, Education Academic at the University of Southampton, specialising in maths and research methods, and a former teacher in the Netherlands. Today we are hunting out research myths and seeking out oversimplifications in the research. Hello, Christian.
Hi, John.
So do you want to give people a little bit of background first on where you're coming from on this hunting out of the research myths? Where's your sort of background? How are you qualified, if you like, to assess this stuff?
Okay, well, you can already hear from my accent I'm not from here. So I was born in the Netherlands and was a secondary school teacher there in mathematics. So my degree is in mathematics, and I also taught computer science, secondary school. Got involved in a lot of projects with Utrecht University, and so basically got involved in academic research and got more and more interested in the way that you could actually do education research, because I thought that a lot of education research sometimes seems a little bit ivory tower on the one hand. But then on the other hand, I always thought that teachers and the general public maybe sometimes feel that it's very easy to do. You just have a control group, experimental group, and then you go and then you're done, and then we can see how effective this is. And I think it turns out that it's actually one of the hardest sciences perhaps to study. So I started doing more and more research, finished my PhD in 2011, and then in 2012 came to England. My mother's English, so I do have some kind of bond already with England, and encountered a vibrant discussion, sometimes maybe too vibrant, within the education community. I was already very active on social media in the Netherlands, actually on Twitter especially. And I could roll in straight away and commented on quite a lot of, especially sort of methodological issues and the way that science is perceived, and perhaps social science, education research, and the rest is sort of history. I think I can say I'm quite active still on social media and try to do a fair, I would say, evaluation and judgment of how I see things with regard to education research. And
your maths background obviously enables you to look in detail at the statistical work that goes on in a lot of research, but also because you are a practicing academic yourself, you look at the research methodology side of stuff as well. How much do you think of, the most popular theories around at the moment, how much of that do you think is fully understood by teachers in terms of, is it an easy process? You've gone through the process of becoming a teacher to an academic. Is it as simple as picking up some papers and reading them and trying to understand them, or is that translation a difficult process?
I think it's, if you all have to do it on your own, that is a difficult process, I think. But of course you're not alone. There is a whole sort of society out there, and I think especially one reason I'm on social media is that you have a sort of the wisdom of the crowd helping you and sending you interesting papers and interesting findings. But of course in that process of translating difficult, complex papers and findings into sound bites, 280 character sound bites now, that is difficult as well. So I think you do need to be careful that you don't get some kind of Chinese whispers almost, where you start off with a very complex situation and basically you morph the whole message of this nuanced message of an academic into 280 characters that sometimes feels like a good representation, but just as often perhaps seems a little bit like a shortcut. And then of course it becomes tricky. In the end, a teacher simply needs to adopt and integrate it in their daily practice. And you can shout as often as you want that X should work, but if it's not working while I'm teaching, I'm going to adjust, and I might be doing other things that on paper should not be as efficient.
That process of sort of trying to simplify a research message obviously is something that we've talked about with the EEF and how they sort of translate their research to a teacher audience, and the belief that to engage with the research, some of the language of research is so impenetrable that some simplification of the theory is needed. In that process of simplification, is it often done in an ideological way, so that people are interpreting through their own ideology, or is it a simple misunderstanding sometimes, or a lack of time to fully appreciate the argument, or perhaps a mix of all three?
I was going to say all of the above, I think. It also depends a little bit whom you talk to. There are people who would argue, and researchers as well, and even paradigms that basically say that all knowledge is sort of biased in a sense, and is perceived through a certain lens. And even if you go back in the centuries, you get whole discussions with Hume and Kant, philosophy, that discuss exactly those things. So probably a little bit of that. There is a lot of confusion probably in terminology. Two interesting papers were published, I think, in the last 5 years or something, exactly about, for example, psychological terms that nobody better can use, or pairs of psychological terms where there is confusion between the two terms, when in daily life you would simply use them interchangeably.
Okay.
So then you've got a problem, really. And things like significant, by the way, is an example, because significant in statistics has a specific meaning, and one that has been criticized. But significant in a sort of something significant happened in my life, that has a sort of daily meaning as well.
What's the difference between those two terms? And if I say something significant to my life, obviously it means it's changed something, or it's important. In statistics, what does significant mean in that context?
Well, it is part of, it's often used in the context of a so-called null hypothesis, significance testing. So significance then is attached to, for example, and they have been criticized a lot, but p-values, so sort of the amount of evidence against a certain null hypothesis or a null assumption. And that is quite a specific, and you can calculate these thresholds, and then you can say, there is a significant effect. But because we use significant in daily life in important, significant, important, that is not exactly the same as how it's used in statistical testing. And if you would then use it in your daily life, you say, no, it was clearly a significant result. That those, if it's in the statistical sense, that is different from sort of in the daily use sense.
And that's where I guess we get confused in terms of, if we're saying, but this test done by this person disproves the way you teach, because look how significant their results were, or how reliable. We always attribute it to a reliability.
That's another good one. Reliability. Yeah. Would you buy a car from someone who is unreliable?
Yeah.
And it would say, no, of course not. Who would buy a car from an unreliable person? But reliability also has a specific sort of research methods connotation, and there are different types of reliability. If for example, we observe something, or let's say we mark a paper, and you do this and I do this, and then we look whether we have marked it in the same way, we get the same score. Then we have so-called inter-rater reliability. So we have two raters, like us two, and then we look how much agreement is there between us two. And you can quantify this, and that is one form of reliability. But reliability can also be so-called retest reliability. So if I give one test to a student on day one, and 10 days later I give the same test, will the score be exactly the same, or will the score be the same? Because sometimes it is important, because it shouldn't be based on the whim of the day, or because you've had a crisis on exactly one day. That's a different form of type of reliability. So just as serving as an example that indeed terminology also comes into play and is very important. We use labeling often, of course, to sort of summarize in one go, in one word, what we mean by that. But I think it does make sense to sometimes probe a little bit deeper whether we really have a common understanding of the term that we are talking about, because you can have sort of big bad things can happen if you're not on the same page in that respect.
Yeah, and we've spoken before as well about the unseen research, the publication bias in research. So not only is the research that as a teacher we might access and read and try and find our way through all those misunderstandings and terminologies you just talked about, but also we need to have an appreciation of what isn't there. Can you talk a little bit about that as well, about the publication bias, about some of the work you've done around saying, well, what aren't we seeing?
Yes, I would say publication bias might actually be one of the biggest challenges for academia or science in general, because I think perhaps it's actually quite human that you want something special to arise from a piece of research. Students often come to me and they say, "Oh, but look, nothing special came out of this." And in a sense, my job then is to say, well, it doesn't really matter. But we all know or have this feeling that you wish something exciting would come out of a piece of research. It's actually not very realistic to expect that, because a lot of things don't work, or they should not work, and some things do work. And the problem is we don't know upfront what will work and what won't work. So that means that I think it's quite reasonable to expect a lot of so-called null results. So there is no effect, or nothing has happened, nothing comes out of it. But when you want to go and publish in journals, especially some people would say the bigger, more prominent journals like Nature and Science, for example, which again I know education research doesn't sort of normally publish in there, but just as an example, then it would be difficult to get into those journals, because if your result is, oh yeah, this is a result, nothing special really happened. And I think we all understand why that is on the one hand. But it also poses a big problem, because it means that in those journals you basically get the positive results, the favorable results. So that is, in a nutshell, publication bias. And those are the journal articles that we then sort of use to present a certain case, to say, oh look, 100 in meta-analyses, for example, meta-reviews, 100 studies said that it would work, so it must really be working, because otherwise there wouldn't have been 100. But of course that is only because those 100 have been published. And what is almost impossible to find out is how many studies have there been that have never been published and just ended up in a big drawer. So a different name for publication bias is file drawer problem. Exactly for that reason. Why have so many studies, or how many studies perhaps, have ended up in these drawers? And because it's notoriously hard to find out, of course, we know it's there, that problem, but it's very hard to really tackle it.
And so when you're in this field, you're an academic, you see a new paper, so you're looking for all these things. You're looking for publication bias, you're looking for the terminology used, you're looking for the methodology used, you're looking for the variables taken into consideration. I mean, how much time does it take? You're doing this day in, day out. How much time does that take to assess a piece of research for all those factors?
A lot of time, yeah. You really, for if you really do close reading, I think you can get and again, I would say that I'm now hopefully quite trained to do this fairly quickly, and to know where to go exactly in a paper. If you want a quick impression, then maybe 15 minutes would be enough. But if you really want to dive into for example, the instruments, or the wording of the questions, or even the statistical methods, or something that also happens a lot, referencing certain papers and checking if the actual interpretation or the summary, because you can't sort of put the whole paper within your own paper, you need to summarize it, whether it actually summarizes the other paper correctly, or whether it's cherry picking or not, etc. You would have to trace down perhaps certain citations that are in. So if you really have the full work, you're talking about hours, I would say, really.
And that's for someone who, like you, who knows what they're looking for, essentially.
Yes.
So
yeah.
in terms of teachers being able to do this with the time limitations they have, if they, let's say they got to the point where they could do that 15-minute check very, very efficiently, maybe it takes them half an hour, maybe they can squeeze that into their already busy schedule. Should they be taking that glimpse that you're talking about and making assumptions of that? Is that a safe thing to do, or should you only make assumptions or decisions on research once you've done the days research?
It's a difficult one, because I would say to try and refrain from big conclusions until you have a sort of a more fuller overview of the situation. I think in that sense meta reviews try to do exactly that, but of course and there should be a systematic way of studying all these papers. But you can't completely, of course, rule out that there might still be some kind of bias. For example, in what studies you include. Some people would say everything qualitative, away with it, not rigorous enough, etc., etc. Which I think would be a shame, because they often give a more richer picture of the situation, but it is harder to generalize from them. So I would say that I think it's useful to do that, to analyze an article and read articles, but perhaps more to get a sense of the enormous complexity and variables that are at play, rather than having a silver bullet at the end. Oh, look, this article says it should work. Because you could argue that because science is incremental, we build on previous science and we keep on building. One study will never be enough. Sort of the study of all studies that finally showed that it worked. It's actually the whole body of knowledge that builds, and triangulation, for example, where you look at the same phenomenon from different perspectives, perhaps with 10 robust experimental studies, but then also 10 more qualitative studies where you actually interview people, and then maybe even some econometric papers that look at policy and whether the sort of over time. So this whole, I would say, package of studying a certain phenomenon, that, in my view, can bring you closer to some sort of conclusion.
It's interesting you say that, because you so often you get in these debates, you say, let's say mixed ability grouping is better than setting, or let's say this is how you do teacher assessment, and people say, okay, how do you know that? And you'll get a single study cited or a single theorist cited. So they'll say, I don't know, for mixed ability teaching they might cite the work of Becky Francis or somebody like that, even though that study's yet to publish fully yet. But in that sense, that's a sort of dangerous. If you're not caveating those statements with, obviously this is a complex situation, then it's dangerous to take, as you say, like a silver bullet from those single names or single studies.
I think so. It does depend a little bit on whether sometimes more than one study sort of is included in new studies, of course. And ideally, you would have a thorough literature review even before a new study is conducted. That's the part I like least, to be honest, in doing research, where you have to summarize the previous research and show that you are doing an original contribution, you're doing something new. I don't like it for the reason I said earlier, because, why does it have to be new? Sometimes you can even replicate old stuff to see if it works in different contexts, but I like it even less because it sometimes feels like looking back rather than looking forward. On the other hand, you need to look at the more complete picture. So I agree that with these caveats should always be added to a piece of research. It can never be the sort of the end of all discussions, etc. That doesn't mean, sometimes this statement is misconstrued, that it means that I don't believe in some things being more valid and reliable than other things. No, you certainly there is more evidence for certain things than for other things, of course. For example, I would say the role of socioeconomic status in education. I think there is quite a body of literature that at least says that it plays a role, which is quite, I would say, a safe conclusion to take. So, yeah, caveats, I like them. Some people feel that it doesn't bring us more certainty, but that's exactly the point. Because pretending that we are sure and certain about certain things, now I'm using the word certain, by the way, in two different ways, is exactly what actually can cause this sort of overconfident feeling of, oh, now we finally know that we know, you just do this and then it will work.
Yeah. And so your journey from teacher to academic, the aim of this podcast is to look at some of the myths in education and to find the sort of oversimplifications. And I think going through the process that we've just done sort of highlights that this isn't about blaming teachers for misinterpreting research.
Absolutely not. No.
But it's about looking at, sort of a bit of background really to what we're going to do next, which is to look at some of the key theories that are prominent in education, and for you to explain a little bit about, where some of the misunderstandings or oversimplifications have occurred. And do you want to start perhaps with Hirsch, as he's our schools minister's favourite academic and obviously heavily influential in the knowledge-based curriculum? Where do you think Hirsch has been misinterpreted or oversimplified?
So I read his last book. I sometimes try to blog. I'm not a very good blogger, I must admit. At least my writing could be a bit more exciting, I would say. But that's why we've got you for, of course, and other media. But I think he's a very interesting person, to be honest. One thing that I certainly needs to be taken into account, I would say, is the US context.
Okay.
I know a little bit about the sort of the latest developments with, but not all Common Core reforms in American education. I think we all heard about things like charter school developments, etc. And perhaps some people even heard about how after New Orleans, for example, the whole school system was gone because of the what was it, tornado? No.
Hurricane
Katrina. Tornado, hurricane. I need to brush up on my knowledge there. And that it was wiped away and they started a whole new movement, etc., etc. So I would say the US context is one thing that needs to be very prominent in evaluating and thinking about Hirsch. I read his latest book. I loved it a lot because one thing I do like a lot is people who are passionate about fairness in education, and I think throughout the book, and you talk to him, I think it's quite obvious that he wants education to be more fair for everyone, and that's another US context, of course. If I am to go on the coefficients for equality or inequality, things like the so-called Gini coefficient, for example, then the USA is actually quite unequal, an unequal country. Rich are rich, poor poor. The division is quite strong, and I think in education as well that has its impact on education. So I think part of his desire of more fairness is also fed by the gross inequality that perhaps is in the USA. So I understand that and I love that. I do think that he himself, but maybe even the people interpreting him even more, do exaggerate a little bit when it comes to, for example, the role of knowledge. Well, I know immediately that if I say something like that, some people say, oh, are you saying knowledge is not important?
Yeah.
Because that's how discussions go. You get almost a binary that if you are not for us, you are against us. And that's not what I mean, because I think actually knowledge underpins everything. And you need knowledge. There are different types of knowledge, declarative knowledge like facts, and maybe even procedural knowledge, doing stuff, etc. And I think that's one occasion in his book where he, and especially the interpretations of his work, simplify a little bit too much. Because these different types of knowledge are also relevant. So simply, I would say, summarizing it, as my feeling is some are doing, that knowledge is everything, simply disregards this distinction between different types of knowledge, in my view. Another part is the whole chapter about France. I really understand that process, because we sometimes need to make things more simple, because otherwise we just get crazy. We need to sometimes simplify things. In the end, if you want to go to the cinema or not, or when you're standing in front of the sweet store, you need to make a choice and or not bring something home. And you think, oh, well, yeah, I like those, I like that. And you need to make a choice in the end. So I understand that you need to make that choice, but we need to be careful that we don't lose a lot of sort of information along the way, and meaning indeed. Yeah.
And is it then that education is obviously a very complex area because of the number of variables? One other thing you look at is cognitive load theory, John Sweller's theory, which is incredibly popular at the moment. And obviously the variables he has to take into consideration when looking at that theory are extensive, and you've spoken in the past about motivation not actually being part of those studies. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. I think he even explicitly mentions it in his... There's a document that describes the whole history, I think, of cognitive load theory. But it's not part of the framework, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean, of course, that it doesn't exist. And you can then even still have a certain viewpoint on motivation. I think, especially on social media, there are a lot of discussions about whether, for example, motivation adds to better achievement, or achievement leads to more motivation. And my view has always been, and I think it is supported by most of the literature, is that it's a bidirectional nature, because it works both ways.
That's quite a big variable to leave out of a study like that, isn't it?
It just becomes too complex. And I feel a little bit of regret when I leave out these variables, and I even think, oh, but now what does it say now if I don't put that? But I can't put, let's say, 100 variables into this model, because it will take days to compute. It will not be very meaningful, etc., etc. So I understand that. And certainly, just as long as you know exactly what it is you are aiming for, so that's why research questions need to be so precise. And in most research articles, they will be quite precise and be defined, and the terminology will be defined. What do I mean? What is the scope? What do I put in? What do I leave out? All these things should be explained quite extensively, which of course and certainly in PhD thesis that needs to be sorted. In articles you have a word count restriction, so then it already becomes fairly tricky. But then when you get to things like lengths of blogs or articles, it becomes even shorter, becomes even more challenging. And then when you get to 280 characters, well, that becomes even more challenging. So I think it is quite reasonable that you leave things out, but simply be open about it. And I think John Sweller, he is open about this, but also keep in mind what that means for maybe certain claims that are being made.
It suddenly explains why every academic we've had on this podcast has been so nuanced in how they've explained their theories. You know, you get an impression of the body of work from schools, from teachers, from some of the reporting of it. Then you talk to them and you suddenly find everything's incredibly nuanced and different. I mean, group work's a fascinating one. We've spoken before about how some of the people you'd expect not to be on a group work study in favour of group work, for example, might pop up on one. And some of their work is just more complicated than perhaps we're able to comprehend that, in the messaging, if you like. We need...
Yeah, I think so. I like the word nuance. I think there is a paper, a sociology paper, that has the title Expletive Nuance. Which has been cited as a sort of a case against nuance, and I understand the objections, because of course if you can have discussions where everything is overly nuanced. When I love music, and I have a very explicit taste in certain music, but other people haven't, and I hate it when I ask, what music do you like? Oh, a little bit of everything. I like this, and I like this, and I like top 40, and I listen to pop. And then I think, oh no, I want to know what you really think.
Yeah.
So I understand a little bit of the frustration when something gets so nuanced that you don't really get anywhere. But I would say that the facts are the facts, and there are things that are complicated, that are complex. We do one task in our master's understanding education research module, where we ask students to study a wall. Stupid task, really. No, it's not a stupid task, but a lot of students think, what are you talking about, a wall? But you can actually record a lot of things about the wall, the temperature, you can look at the construction, what is it made of, etc. But you can also, where is it standing? Is it part of a larger structure? Over time, like the wall in Jerusalem, what happened with the wall, etc. So we just study the wall, and we look at sort of scientific part, but then there's also the more interpretivist part, the history, etc. Things that you could look at. And students find it incredibly difficult and never realized really how many things you can actually study from something so mundane as a wall. And then we make the link to humans, because a wall is actually quite static. It doesn't go anywhere, really. It doesn't have a thought. It doesn't have any... it can't think, etc. And humans do. Yeah. So replace this wall with one human. And then they realize immediately that it becomes infinitely more complex. And then several humans that can communicate becomes even more complex. So yeah, it is complex. So why pretend otherwise? Yeah. I understand why, because it sometimes makes it more bearable, our life and discussions, and easier. But that doesn't mean that there is any, I would say, more truth to a sort of a simplistic way of defining things. I've seen people quote Occam's razor, for example, which is a heuristic that says that all else being equal, the one with the least assumptions or the simplest theory should be chosen. And it's great as a heuristic, and if all else is equal. But that often is not the case, because it's such a complex situation.
So faced with that, is it down to everybody in the field of education research? So is it about the academics continually talking about the nuance, continually talking about the caveats, to get that message out there? And from the other side, teachers realising that you're not going to get a magic bullet. You're not going to get a theory that explains everything. You're not going to be able to look at the research and the level you've talked about on your own. You're going to have these teams of researchers or groups of teacher researchers. You're going to get a better understanding, and perhaps from both sides we need some cooperation, if you like. Absolutely.
No, I think that is the way forward. I think you need this cooperation. You need, I think, academics, you need senior leadership, you need teachers, you need teaching assistants, you need knowledgeable people from exam boards. You need, basically all of them need to work together. And I must say that there are a lot of sort of, I would say, forces that make that more and more difficult. Sometimes it seems.
Yeah.
And other forces that actually are trying to do some good there. I enjoy the Research Ed series a lot. I presented now there. Was it 2 or 3 times? 3 times, I think, 3 or 4 times, maybe with the Dutch version as well. And we'll be presenting again in Amsterdam. And I think that is the way forward. But there are all kinds of reasons why this is quite hard. I was quite annoyed actually when the minister, when I was presenting at Research Ed, at the same time, literally the same time, he was doing his speech at Research Ed and was talking about ivory tower academics. That is not really an incentive for academics to come out the ivory tower, because what you need is actually maybe even some reform and some appreciation to do so. Which again, if you then look at the higher education minister with its focus on teaching excellence framework, with your colleagues from Times Higher that know everything about this, and the REF, etc., and the publish or perish culture, it is actually very difficult to get some appreciation for the fact that you're going out there and maybe even presented Research Ed. Because, well, we also have a serious, and I'm really doing the quotes here, just to explain, a serious academic conference cycle as well that we need to attend to, and we need to write the articles, and we need to get good student survey scores, etc., because of the fees. So, and I think every discipline, whether it's exam boards or teachers, have their own challenges, a workload for teachers, etc., etc. So we can say it is great if they would work together more, but the infrastructure needs to be in place to actually do this. And I do think that has been in this whole call for more evidence-informed teaching, etc. It doesn't seem to be something that is really very high on the agenda. The theme is high on the agenda, but really helping sort of barriers for actually doing this along, I don't really get the feeling that is being serviced. And it would be great if it did. Maybe some small projects have been started, but it's a question of time and appreciation, like probably all things in life.
That's a nice challenge for the DFE there to put something in place to finish the interview. Christian, thank you very much for joining me. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure. Thank you.